Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I'm an author. And welcome to my writing space. I'm coming to you here today on another Storytime Thursday, where I'm going to be reading chapter 21 of my first book, The Shadow of the Past, entitled The Siege of Takaran. The previous chapters, Val'inar and his allies have succeeded in throwing the Union out of Takaran, the capital of Camral, and have made what preparations they can with the minimum forces available to fortify the city and its citadel in particular. And now we switch here to a chapter, another one that I'm rather enjoying. I'm rather proud of. It's told from the point of view of the commanding general of the Union Army that is now going to be sieging the city. Real quick note before we get started. Please take a moment to. I would love to hear your comments and thoughts on this story, this chapter, the characters, anything so far. I would love to hear any and all of your feedback. Please comment that down below. Also, it'd be amazing if you were to like, share, subscribe, tap that notification bell. Check out my website, my socials, my books. That would be fantastic. All of that would do great things to help me out in the meantime. So, without further ado, here we have Chapter 21, The Siege of Takaran. The midday sun shone overhead and glanced off the top of the citadel. As the light played and danced through the thick fog around the rest of the city, Takaran seemed to glow a golden yellow. This ethereal sight greeted the Union legions as they emerged from the gloom of the forest overlooking the city to the north. They could not see through the dense fog, so they did not know how well the city was defended. Therefore, they approached slowly and began encircling the city. Soon it became apparent that what defenders there were had decided not to actively defend the outer wall. The Union cautiously moved up the great siege towers they had constructed in the night, as well as the battering rams and weapons of war with which to storm the outer gate. Still, they went unchallenged. This concerned General Phinell as he emerged from the tree line with his staff and personal guard. Even a small number of defenders could have made them pay dearly for breaching the outer wall, and that is what he would have done in their place. The fog also concerned him. The sun had been up for hours, and yet it had not dissipated. What was more, it seemed to confine itself exactly to the walls of the city. The elf's magic, he inquired as he reached up to remove his plumed helm so that he could survey the battlefield with greater ease. He handed his helmet to one of his waiting squires and ran a hand through his thick gray hair and rubbed the stiffness from the neck. Time was when he could wear a helmet all day and it would not bother him, but those days were long gone, and getting up before dawn was becoming harder too. That seems likely, admitted the tall, thin, and balding man riding beside him on a gray courser. I do not know his actual power, but such spells require concentration and proximity, so in all likelihood he is still in there somewhere. Phinell considered this for a time as he watched his soldiers approach ever nearer to the outer wall of the city. He watched as they began to slow once more at the city walls. Still, there were no bow shots, no sign of defenders anywhere in sight. He was also aware that one of his subordinates was trying to attract his attention, or he had developed a sudden cough and twitch. He knew what the man wanted, so he let him make a fool of himself for a few minutes before finally inclining his head toward him as a sign to speak. Sir, began the agitated officer, with all due respect, you're too close to the city. Would it not be better to pull back? Why would I pull back? Not even the greatest archer could shoot an arrow this far, observed Phinell. Besides, from my long service, I've discovered that it is far easier to give effective orders when one can see what is happening with one's own eyes. But General Phinell, continued the young officer, we have them outnumbered many times over, and the army is well trained and experienced. Certainly your subordinates can do a fine job. I also notice that you have taken but little breakfast. Would you not prefer to have a good meal and then come and survey how our victory is progressing later this morning? This brought a smile to Phinell's face, and to the faces of his staff, and to that of Archmage Hyrus, as he remembered what it was like to be so young and confident. I do have every confidence in the army and to the commanders therein, but Takaran is no ordinary fortification, and we are fighting no ordinary enemy. No, it is better that I am on hand in the likely event that something we have not predicted occurs. I also thank you for your kindness, but I prefer to eat frugally and share the lot of my men when possible. The young commander moved to open his mouth, but a stern but not unkind look from the general convinced him that silence would be a wiser course of action, and he turned and rode away to see to his other duties. Phinell allowed himself another smile before turning back towards the battlefield. He spent several minutes trying to pierce the veil of fog with his eyes, but he could not. His careworn and intense brown eyes were still excellent, but there was nothing for them to see. He began to stroke his thin white beard as he pondered what to do. I have decided, he said with more confidence than he felt. This fog is meant to delay us by making us fear that there are defenders that are not actually present. They must have pulled their forces back to the citadel, hoping that it would take us most of the day to get our nerve up and take the wall, unopposed though we are. Therefore, my orders to all forward cohorts are attack now, scale the walls and get the gates open. Once that is done, send advance parties through the city to secure it and begin investing the citadel for a siege. Several waiting messengers rode off immediately to give his orders to the front line, which soon started to move forward at full march, and in less than half an hour the first of his soldiers had crested the wall and disappeared within the fog. He was worried that he had made a mistake when they disappeared out of sight, which seemed like hours to him, although it could not have been for more than a few minutes, before several of the gates swung inward, allowing his soldiers to march in. Seeing the forward cohorts pouring through the gateways of the city gave Phinell a rush of confidence, and he issued a rapid series of orders for camps to be set up all around the outside of the city, even now cautious in case the army needed to decamp and march out quickly. He moved forward himself at the head of the second wave of soldiers, which elicited a cheer from his men as they saw him leading them towards the city, to which he beamed a smile and bowed his head several times in thanks. The area around the north gate of Takaran was abuzz with activity and a cacophony of shouts as soldiers ran to and fro to set up tents and organize the progression of forces into the city. The gates were not large enough to admit some of their larger siege engines, so there was also the work of partially dismantling them so they could be moved in and brought to bear on the citadel. Some of the soldiers were still nervous about moving through the gate and into the dense wall of fog, but seeing that there were messengers running in and out of the city, most of them regained their nerve almost immediately. Phinell had to admit that the fog still worried him, although seeing the fog glow a faint orange from all the torches of his men were carrying dispelled some of that worry. His command tent was set up almost at once, and when it was, he dismounted his charger and proceeded to decide. There was a large wood table at the center of the open-sided tent with a large map of the city outlined upon it. His aides, along with a large group of messengers, were endeavoring to get accurate information as to where his soldiers were deploying within the city. More worrying was that they had yet to receive reports as to where the enemy was and the strength of his position. Phinell pored over the map, giving the occasional order, and contemplated what the quickest way to breach the citadel would be. He knew that Union agents had provided accurate detail of the city's citadel's layout and defenses, but that only troubled him more. The citadel was extremely well constructed, and the walls had been rendered virtually indestructible. The gates were more vulnerable, but even that would take time, and he was not sure about how much time they had. For the past several days, most of the scouts that he had sent out had not reported back, which led him to suspect even more strongly the enemy had reinforcements moving towards Takaran at that very moment. And if the enemy did not slip up their screen, he might not know when and where and how many until they appeared on the horizon. This quiet contemplation was snapped by a breathless messenger staggering into the tent. Phinell caught the phrase out of the fog before the young man passed out and was unable to be wakened. He had feared that there was something in the fog, but he was not sure what exactly the messenger had meant. His puzzlement was short-lived when another messenger came running into the tent. This young woman was far less out of breath and able to provide the clear report that all of the advanced units had been ambushed as they made their way towards the citadel. It seemed that their enemy, wearing gray cloaks to further blend with the fog, had lain in wait for them, and the soldiers were unaware of their presence until they were right on top of them. Phinell lost no time in sending orders that his soldiers should progress through the city only in strength and to keep moving, but more slowly towards the citadel. He was gratified nearly an hour later when he received reports that the enemy was being pushed back. At last, the report came that all the enemy soldiers had retreated to within the citadel. He was not happy to hear, however, that three overeager cohorts had rushed the gate on seeing it open and were beaten back with heavy losses for their trouble. Almost at the same time that this last report came to him, some of his soldiers also noticed that the fog was beginning to lift. Phinell laughed to himself. He should have expected it. The element of surprise was gone, and it was now getting toward evening. The fog had done its job admirably. It had delayed his movement through the city, and the successful ambushes had cost him nearly 600 men dead or wounded, while the enemy had lost a score at the most. Now that they had been driven back to the citadel and his men were taking up positions to invest the citadel in a siege, Val'inar's archer would need to see their targets as much as his own did. Phinell was solemnly watching the dead be carried from the city along with Archmage Hyrus when Knight Captain Aaron, the commander of the Third Legion, approached him to inquire whether should make an initial assault upon the citadel while there was still daylight. Phinell stroked his white mustache, as was his custom, and regarded the tall, broad-shouldered, and heavily armored man who stood before him. He could see quite clearly why he had been known as the Bull since his earliest days of training, especially since he fingered the handle of his great war hammer in such the same way an angry bull paws at the ground before the charge. That would be unwise, he said at last, noting the way the man twitched in frustration when he had said this. Our men are tired, and the citadel is a mighty fortress. Form a rotation of the archers for the night so that our men can all get a few hours' rest while we keep up a barrage of arrows over the walls. As soon as the catapults, trebuchets, and ballistae are set up, order them to begin firing as well. When night falls, set the rocks and bolts on fire. With any luck, our men will get a better night's sleep than our enemy, which should make our assault tomorrow more effective. He could tell that the bull wished very much to object, but he was too good of a soldier to disobey a direct order, so he stalked off to see to his commands. He also turned to his companion and asked that the mages set up a rotation throughout the night in order to keep up attacks on the enemy as well. Shortly the air was alive with the distant thumping and swishing and twanging of the siege instruments at work. To Phinell's surprise, the air was almost immediately filled with distant screams. For a few short moments he thought that the siege was going quite well until a messenger nearly plowed into him. The young man bowed deeply and then blurted out his report so quickly and so breathlessly that Phinell had to command him to repeat the message thrice before he got it all. He was not surprised that the enemy had taken the time to improve the defenses of the citadel, but he had never heard of such magic before, and neither had Hyrus, to his even greater surprise. Apparently, the enchantments now extended above the outer walls of the citadel. All the arrows they shot at it burst apart in flames as soon as they got above the wall. Most of the spells seemed to dissipate upon reaching the same point, and the ballistae bolts suffered a similar fate. Most of the stones from the catapult and trebuchet did cross the point, but they seemed unable to do the slightest damage to either the wall or the citadel itself. A few, however, seemed to hit some kind of barrier and bounce back toward his own soldiers, who were clustering near the wall, eager for the attack that would come in the morning. The enemy archers had not yet shown themselves, but they also were clearly in possession of their own catapults and had mapped out targeting in the city quite well, as several of his siege engines had already been taken out by rocks from the enemy machines. Well, muttered Archmage Hyrus almost to himself, following every law of magicraft that I know, you have to enchant something. You can't just apply it to the air. So if some mage is maintaining it, they cannot maintain it forever. Possibly, yes, possibly that only some of the stones are being deflected. And what about the arrows? Demanded Phinell with a touch of impatience. That kind of protection is much easier, said Hyrus far more clearly. There are many mages who could do that, so if they focus themselves upon the task. Phinell stroked his beard in thought for a moment and leaned heavily upon the planning table. His strength just did not last the way it once did. He could feel himself fading. He would need to rest soon if he was to conduct the siege properly. Well, no sense in wasting arrows, he said almost to himself, and then louder. Order the archers to cease fire and get them to a safe distance. We'll have them resume when they make our assault in the morning. And the kata began one of his subordinates and ordered the siege engines to reposition themselves every few shots to make it more difficult to get the range. That will slow down the rate of fire considerably, but should cut down on our own casualties while keeping fire upon the enemy. Make sure the movements are staggered so that there is always something firing. I'll order the same for my mages, commented Hyrus as a young sergeant went dashing off to give the order. I'll make sure they keep moving around, but keep up fire so they can wear down the magical barrier. Good thinking, Hyrus, nodded Phinell. I shall retire to my tent for the evening. Wake me if anything changes, and have Sergeant Gerald brought to me at first light. Yes, sir, his aide snapped to attention as he made his way towards his tent. Oh, he said, turning back towards them just before he got to the tent flap. See to it that all the men get a decent meal before first light. I don't want them fighting on an empty stomach. Night did not bring rest. The distant thuds of his siege engines and the occasional drifting screams of his men combined with his own unease to keep sleep from his eyes. Time was, he remembered, when the night was an ally. He could not tell the number of times he had lain himself down on the cold, hard earth for a few hours' rest, and in the quiet of the night, fresh solutions to problems he faced would dance before his eyes. All he could see now was the darkness behind his eyes. He cursed himself as he lay there trying to sleep. He should have sent for the sergeant sooner. What he needed was information. He felt as if he were fighting blind. He was facing an enemy he did not understand, and that was always dangerous. He knew that he outnumbered his opponent greatly. That alone should all but guarantee victory, but how many of his soldiers would have to die before he could achieve it? The fact that none of the day's patrols had returned worried him as well. He knew there were enemy forces on the move against him, but he did not know where. He also knew that word had no doubt been sent to the other cities of Cameral, and it was only a matter of time before their formidable armies rallied against him. He could certainly take Takaran with time, but he was increasingly unsure just how much time he had. As he drifted off to a restless sleep at last, his mind wandered back to the glorious day, some 40 years since, when he was in his prime. He had been the first over the wall of Rhinaran with the mighty 13th Legion at his back. He had cut down 2 defenders, surprised though they were that simple mud had been used to protect the ladders from the fire enchantments placed on their walls, before any of his other soldiers had swung themselves over the ramparts. He had felt invincible on that day. Little had he known that assault would be but the opening act of what was now being called the Unification Wars. And just as his home was recovering from the devastation wrought by that conflict, here he was, leading another army against another enemy city. The sun's first rays found a young sergeant sliding into his tent to find him already awake, dressed and lying upon his camp bed, deep in thought. The young man stood there nervously for a moment before clearing his throat, which brought Phinell out of his contemplation. He smiled at the young man and ordered that all his senior commanders meet him at the planning tent as soon as they were able to, and to see that breakfast was brought. The sergeant snapped off a quick salute and raced away. Phinell stood and stretched himself out. He was still strong, but with age he found that his limbs needed daily stretching in order to maintain every part of their former skill. After this was done, he walked out of his tent and made his way to the strategy tent. Apart from his aides and commanders, there stood 3 soldiers. 2 were his own guards, but the middle one bore a somewhat different tabard than his own soldiers. He took this soldier to be Sergeant Gerald, former adjutant to Commander Bavair, and one of the few to have made it out of Takaran alive when the city's population rose against the Union soldiers. The woman looked nervous and tired. Phinell guessed that she had not slept properly since fleeing Takaran. Nearly 5 days passed. He beckoned her forward, not unkindly, as he moved towards the knot of commanders gathered around the table. Sergeant Gerald has provided us with information on the number of defenders within Takaran, said Commander Venya, the head of the 12th Legion, a short but powerfully built woman. Unfortunately, it is little more than an educated guess, since we have no way of knowing how many Don soldiers chose to stay and help fight and whether they got any additional forces inside their walls before we besieged the city. There cannot be more than 1,000 soldiers within Takaran, however, possibly a fair amount less. That information will no doubt prove useful, responded Phinell, but that is not why I've ordered that the sergeant join us today. Sergeant Jarrow, please tell us everything you can about this elf that leads the enemy force. We must learn all we can about him. All eyes turned to the sergeant, and she met them with a determination born from fear. Val'inar, she began, faltering, but then became clearer as she kept speaking. He is like nothing I have ever seen before. Our archers tried to kill him on Commander Bever's last order, but he tore their arrows aside with a wave of his hand. I managed to rally our men. He charged us. I did not see him cast one spell or weave one enchantment, but just before he reached our line, it was like the Terra itself had declared war upon us. The power he unleashed killed but few of us, but in the confusion of elements, my soldiers lost their focus and were torn apart by the fury of the people of Takaran. Many tried, but none could stand against the elf and his power. He fought 4 or 5 at a time, but none could harm him. One of our soldiers, a promising young man named Grethus, managed to find a way around the elf's dancing blade and drove his own sword into his side with all his might. The blade stopped dead, a mere inch from the elf's body. Although there was a gap in his armor there, and he was unharmed. Grethus did not have the time to take a stab. He saved my life as a distracted Val'inar as he was about to strike me down. It was at that moment that I knew that my men had no chance and did what my commander ordered me to do if such should happen, and I fled the city to ensure that you were warned to move on to Karn at once. You did well, Sergeant, smiled Phinell. He could only imagine what it had been like to see your men slaughtered around her, including a soldier who had saved your life. What was this Val'inar like in the duel that he fought with Bever? The duel was a duel of honor in the tradition of Cameron. They fought without armor and without enchantment, replied Gerald, with a good deal more confidence. The elf is a good swordsman, but without his power he is nothing extraordinary. Like all of his kind, he lacks the strength of a human, but is faster and more agile. The sword he wields seems a little heavy for his strength. He tired quickly, and Bever had the better of him for most of the duel. Bever had the elf on the ground, but he got careless. He fought to embarrass the elf, and the elf managed to take advantage of this and knocked him off his balance just long enough to kill him. Phinell took this information in and thought for a few minutes before turning to Hyros. Have you ever heard of someone having the power to prevent injuries to themselves? Actually, I have, replied Hyros spiritedly. It is not a particularly complex enchantment, but it takes a great amount of power and concentration to maintain it for even a little while, and does not protect well from other magecraft. Which is why very few mages ever even bother to learn the weaving of it. It is, however, extremely impressive that this Val'inar was able to maintain the enchantment for so long, and to do so while fighting. He must indeed be powerful. Is there anything that can get through this enchantment? If he is as powerful as I think he is, none of my mages and none of your weapons can, at least not singly. However, if he is forced to maintain it for a long period of time, he will eventually tire, and it will make it harder for him to recast other spells and weave other enchantments. Although we may be able to distract him. What could possibly distract him, Phinell mused, to himself as much as to anyone else. Just because a weapon cannot hurt him doesn't mean it will not affect him, chimed in Sergeant Gerald. What do you mean, young woman? Inquired Hyros, gazing at her in amusement. During the initial fighting through the streets, responded Gerald, one of our archers managed to get around behind him and fire an arrow at him. The arrow rebounded off this enchantment, but it caused him to stagger forward a couple of steps. Of course, shouted Herass. Of course, our weapons cannot harm him, but he will still feel some force of the blow. A strong enough force, and he could be knocked to the ground, and if that breaks his concentration, then killing him should not be difficult. At this, Knight Captain Aaron strode forward. I will do it, and that is all. If that is all it takes to distract him when I stand, then I stand the best chance. Me and my warhammer. He hefted the massive warhammer in his hands and smiled as he tested its weight. Phinell studied the man. He was certainly an extremely capable warrior, and his skills with the warhammer were fast becoming legendary. But still, he neither liked nor trusted the man. He was ill-tempered and arrogant, too confident in his own skills. Aaron was everything that he wasn't, but Phinell could not make up his mind whether that was a bad thing or merely made him prejudiced against him. All eyes were on him, and after a moment deliberation, he said, very well, I see no reason to delay. With any luck, they will either be exhausted from maintaining their enchantment all night, or will have grown overconfident in it. Our best chance may lie with a full assault. Knight Captain Aaron, your third legion will lead the charge. Prepare your men. Tryon, Eleusine, your legions will serve as backup. All other legions have your archers begin a full barrage in 1/2 hour. I know most of the arrows will likely not get through, but we have to wear them down. Let us get to work. With that, all of his commanders broke away from the table and headed into the city to see to it that their men were ready. Phinell noticed that some food had been brought while the deliberation occurred, and he, nervous as to the outcome of this assault and therefore not much hungry, selected a simple loaf of bread and moved into the city himself. A balcony on the third floor of an inn, quite close to the citadel, had been selected as his headquarters during the battle, and he made his way there. As the minutes ticked by, he chewed little bits of the bread just to give himself something to do. At last the half hour was up, and the cry went up across the city, and leaping from between the packed streets came a cloud of arrows like a swarm of furious bees. Just as his subordinates reported, as soon as the arrows got over the wall, many of them seemed to be shredded as if by a great wind, although he noticed that a few seemed to get through. The siege engines had better luck with most of their stones sailing over the walls, although there was something disconcerting about when one of them would ricochet off like a child's toy off the ground. He had to admire the construction that had gone into the citadel, for even the stones that he could clearly see impact the wall or the citadel beyond seemed to leave no mark. As for response, that worried him. There were no bow shots being returned by their enemy, nor any response to the spells Hyrus's mages continued to lob over the walls. Occasionally a stone would go sailing over the wall from the citadel, but that was a rare occasion. Although although with the streets so packed with men of the three legions preparing for the charge, he winced whenever it did, as each stone likely killed or wounded dozens of his men. He allowed this to go on for about an hour, but finally he had to admit that it looked as though the barrage was having no effect upon his enemy, so he gave the signal. A clear and solitary horn blast rebounded from the rooftops of Takaran. With that, the firing stopped. There was a moment of almost palpable silence that seemed to go on for an eternity, and then the great bellowing shout of charge was heard, and he saw the Third Legion rush forward. He could see a troop of soldiers carrying shields over their heads rush forward with the battering ram, which was a monstrous thing of fire-hardened wood, with a fitted iron ram's head upon the end of it. Soon that was crashing into the door every few seconds. It was too far away to see it clearly, but it did not seem to affect the great gate in any way, although battering rams often took time to have any noticeable effect. Now the defenders were responding. Heads began to appear above the rampart, and arrows began to sail over the wall in earnest. And the pace of the firing of the enemy catapults greatly increased as well. Bursts of fire and wind tore through the charging soldiers as they clustered close to the wall and began to raise the ladders. His own archers and mages began to move in closer to the wall so that they could get clear shots at their enemies. It was too dangerous to launch a hail of arrows with their own men so close, but they could still pick off enemy soldiers. Ladders were soon covering the wall. The defenders were able to push some of them down or over, but not all of them. Some of his soldiers were nearing the tops of the ladder, and Aaron was at their lead. He had to credit the knight captain for bravery, if nothing else. The rampart came up to the waist of a man, and his position was slightly below eye level, so it was difficult to see exactly what was going on, but the fight certainly looked to be fierce. It looked as though Iran had already knocked two of the defenders from the wall with his hammer and was menacing several others who were trying to back away from him in the press. There he was, the elf. Approaching Iran from his right was an armored figure taller than most of his men. He wore a cloak of almost midnight black, had an helmet and greaves that were the color of bronze, and a chest plate that looked like a starry night on a clear night. Starry sky and a clear night all over a tunic of deep green. In his hands was a long and elegantly curved sword that seemed to be every color at once. He strode forward with a cool confidence and almost effortlessly killed three men who tried to oppose him before reaching Aaron. This could only be Val'inar. Soldiers from both sides backed away out of self-preservation when the two finally met. Aaron swung aggressively and savagely and quickly had the elf on the defensive. The elf was certainly quick, dodging a strong overhand blow and striking Aaron with the pommel of his sword. Aaron was not even phased and spun quickly, forcing Val'inar to duck and roll out of the way. The following blow crashed down upon the elf's back, knocking him to the ground. Aaron stood over the elf and made ready to finish the job. Phinell then saw a hand rise from the ramparts, and a crackling burst of lightning jumped from the hand and struck Aaron square in the chest, knocking him backwards. Phinell could clearly see the blade, so Phinell could barely see the blade, so quickly did it move as it arced through the air and bit through one of Aaron's hands. The bull, always so strong and proud, looked scared and weak as he stared in disbelief at his severed hand. Val'inar effortlessly drove his sword through the man's stomach. Aaron made his own last effort to lift his warhammer, but the elf almost casually backhanded Aaron and sent him tumbling over the ramparts. Phinell stood in shock as he watched the leader of the Third Legion fall to the ground, which seemed to take an eternity. As he hit the ground, the battle seemed to pause for a moment as all eyes turned to the elf. He had placed a hand on top of the rampart and his eyes were closed. Phinell realized too late that what the elf was about to do and could only stand to gape when it happened. All the ladders, still laden with his men, burst into flames and crumbled, sending more than 100 soldiers falling to the ground, some of them on fire as well. "Pull the soldiers back," he shouted as soon as he shook off his surprise. "Tell the mages to put protective enchantments on the siege towers, and when they have done so, send the soldiers in again. Move!" Two mournful notes resonated out from the balcony he was standing upon, and the soldiers began to move back, still menaced by the arrows and spells of their enemies. As soon as his soldiers were out of effective targeting range, the defenders disappeared below the ramparts once more. Enchanting the siege towers took longer than he had hoped, and it wasn't until more than an hour after noon that the first group of them rolled up to the walls of the citadel. Knowing the constraints of time, he went against his better judgment and pressed the attack until dust fell over the city, despite the lack of any new ground being gained. More than a 2 dozen groups of soldiers took turns swinging the battering ram, and all reported that the door did not give an inch. Many of the siege towers were still destroyed despite their enchantments, while waiting upon the wall for his soldiers to make their way to the ramparts. The fighting on the ramparts was fierce, with the elf making several more appearances throughout the afternoon. He certainly saw as well that the people of Cameral had well earned their reputation of being excellent soldiers, and whatever mages were aiding Val'inar were no doubt powerful as well. Or the elf was even stronger than Hyras and the other mages figured him to be. Phinell sat by the firelight of the camp and pored over the reports of casualties drawn up by his subordinates. The already painful reading was increased by the sound of shovels sliding into the earth as a mass grave was dug for all those who had died. In the space of a single day, nearly 1,500 of his soldiers, men he had met their, of his own men had met their deaths, and nearly 5 times that number had been wounded, many greatly. The Third Legion was shattered, and the Seventh and 11th were depleted. If things kept going at this rate, it would look like he would need to delay building more siege engines in a day or two. More frustratingly, few of his soldiers had survived the ramparts to provide an accurate count of the enemy force or how many of their soldiers had been killed. There certainly were some killed, but as far as anyone could tell, it had only been a hundred at most, and without knowing how many they had to begin with, there was no way of knowing how much damage um, they had done to the enemy. After another fitful night of sleep, Phinell found himself awakened shortly before dawn by an excited Hyras, who breathlessly told him that shortly before dawn, it seemed as though the enchantments preventing arrows from being fired over the rampart had expired. Phinell rose and dressed with haste, all the while barking orders to have the men assembled and begin a barrage as soon as everything was in place. While he hurried through the streets of the city to the inn to observe the battle once more, and while munching on some cheese and an apple, Phinell cursed the need for the siege towers to be placed out of sight of the enemy's citadel, or it would take at least an hour to bring them to bear again. It took longer. The enemy had stepped up their catapult firing, and a few good shots had created obstacles that took time to clear up from the path of the siege towers. It was mid-morning before the towers were in position. Despite the horrendous losses from the day previously, his soldiers seemed in high spirits, as was he. His enemy was strong but not invulnerable. What the night before had seemed a distant and bloody dream seemed a reality. He could win the battle. Just as the last siege tower rolled into position and Phinell was raising his arm to signal a charge, a faint trumpet call sounded in the wind. Phinell doubted he would have heard it at all if it not come from the east, upwind where he was. He hesitated. There was something odd about the call, and something familiar. He stood there for a long moment in thoughts, no doubt looking a fool with his arm half raised in the air. The note rang out again, and that brought it back to him. More than 50 years ago, his first campaign as a new-made knight, 16 years of age. The Romaldans had sent several thousand soldiers around the great fortresses and landed them near his home city of Kelton. He was just a raw recruited in those days, but he had slain 3 enemies and saved his commander's life, earning him his first reward for bravery and his first promotion. Romaldans, he whispered. Did you say Romaldans? Inquired Venya, arching her eyebrows in confusion. Yes, that is a Romaldan trumpet cry, he replied, slowly recovering his senses. How can that be? Jarrell reported that Romaldans had declared war upon us, but they are many miles from here. There was no way they could have brought an army here so quickly. Phinell was just about to agree with her, figuring that lack of sleep was clouding his mind, when a scout came staggering up the final flight of stairs to the balcony where he and his subordinates were standing. He was obviously wounded with an arrow sticking from his chest and out of breath, but he managed. Romaldans coming. East. Don't many. The 3 legions at least. With that, the man collapsed. He was still breathing, but the effort of getting there with the wound had clearly cost him all of his energy. Phinell was on the point of ordering several of his legions to break off and meet this new threat when he got a second shock. A second scout, this one in much better shape than the first, but still quite winded, came staggering in to report that a hold of Tri warriors were approaching from the southwest. The rest of Phinell's commanders had arrived just in time for a third scout to report that a force of dwarves, many thousand strong, was approaching from the north. Phinell had to admire the planning. He did not doubt that the Tri could have been here even before him, but rather than have them harass his men, they had waited to make their approach with the others. It was clearly their hope to entrap his army between themselves and the walls of the citadel. We don't have enough food to maintain ourselves in Takaran if we fortify ourselves within the outer walls, shouted Venya at one of the other legionary commanders. All they would have to do is keep us pinned here until we starved, or the main force of the army of Cameral arrived. We should go after the dwarves first. They are our most dangerous opponents. No, insisted another. The Remoldans are our most dangerous foe. They have been blood enemies to us for so long they will fight us all the more fiercely. Enough, barked Phinell before another of his subordinates could join in the argument. We will do none of those things. We have the strength to crush any of these armies individually and fought all together, but not in the position they are in now. To engage any as we are now would leave us vulnerable to the rest. And with our forces committed in the city, we would have difficulty maneuvering and deploying our soldiers properly. We would be at a disadvantage. Then what do we do? Demanded Venya. We shall withdraw, replied Phinell, calmly staring into their shocked faces. We are in a dangerous position here, so we should withdraw and with haste to the northwest. Once we have once we get our backs to the mountains, we can regroup our army properly, and then meet our enemies at a time and place of our choosing. We could still win the day, observed Venya severely. Yes, we could, admitted Phinell, but especially in range of the citadel and its catapults, we would suffer severe casualties and still have to fight a battle to take the citadel. However, if we withdraw and fight them in a few days, we can crush them easily. Now move. He was afraid for a moment that his companion would not follow his orders, but all of his subordinates saw the wisdom in his words, and so began to organize their soldiers for immediate and swift departure. He was proud of his army's training when it took less than an hour to have his entire army on the march away from Takaran. They had to leave much of their siege equipment behind, but that could be rebuilt later. They also left many of the more severely wounded behind. That had pained Phinell a good deal, but the war needed speed to win, and as much as he did not like it, those men would have slowed him down. Phinell could see from the top of his charger the enemy already in close range as his army marched away. He hoped that the enemy would not be able to catch them up as he shook his head at the disarray of his soldiers were in. As he crested the first hill away from Takaran, he looked back to see the three armies meeting outside the western gate of Takaran, and the defenders emerged to greet them. The noon sun shone brightly upon the stones of Takaran, and that dull yellowish red glow seemed to taunt him as he rode away. The one fortress in his entire career whose capture had eluded him. All right. That is chapter 21. I do hope you enjoy it. I would love for you to like, share, subscribe, tap that notification bell, as well as check out my books, my socials, my website, all that good stuff down below. That would be awesome and really help me out. In the meantime, I do hope you all have a fantastic day, get a chance to do or experience something creative, and I'll catch you in the next one.